So the Latino Policy Forum, just really briefly, we do work on issues of immigration, housing, civic engagement, and education. A lot of it's been focused on trying to increase Latino access to preschool. My work on the team has really been thinking a lot about kids whose first language isn't English and what that means for teacher preparation. And as of late, I've been doing tons of work with parents in that regard too. So that can be a part of the conversation later. Just know us as a resource for the work that you do. And we are throughout the state. So today we're gonna briefly review demographic information. I think intuitively, we all know this pretty well and we're seeing it, but sometimes it's nice to just see it laid out in numbers. We're going to talk a little bit about Common Core today and the heightened language and literacy demands. And while you guys might not be specifically addressing it in a pre-K setting, for example, we know that our students need to get to these new high language and literacy demands. And there's a lot of questions about what this means for kids whose first language isn't English. There's a lot of questions about it anyways, right? But especially for English learners. And then we're going to get into talking about considerations for the preparation of early childhood educators for language and cultural difference. So just so we all know, students from immigrant families will account for all the projected growth in our student population from 2005 to 2020. Pretty amazing. Largely from the Latino community, but we also know Asian. And I get uncomfortable with the word Asian because that's such a diverse group, right? That African American and white student populations have declined. This is nationally, but also in Illinois. We're at the point that 1 of every 4 children in this state have at least one foreign-born parent. And 88% of Illinois children born to immigrants in the US are US citizens, right? We know this is a really young issue, right? When we look at the Latino community, I think it's important to say it's even higher. It's around 93% of Latino children are US citizens. And that's just the way these conversations happen politically. I think it's an important point. So let's do a little guessing game. What percentage of our Illinois students are considered low income? Do you guys all know this? Who thinks it's 15%? I know, I gotta change this because that's like too easy. 25%? A couple think it might be 25, and this is statewide. 49%? Yeah. And then who thinks it's over 50? Yeah, well this year is the first year we hit 50%. So I used to trick people. Yeah, I used to trick people because it was C and it was like, and it was like this dramatic thing. And now we're at 50%. So we have more students identifying as low income than middle class now. So it's always important to have this contextual consideration, right? We have the new post-industrial hourglass economy, right? More and more jobs at the top end of the economy, shrinking middle class, more and more jobs at the lower end. You gotta work 2 to get by. There's no health benefits. They might rob your salary, right? And we also wanna keep in mind when we think about immigration that it's really at both ends of the economy, right? It's polarized as well. So some of our immigrants have done really well. Bill Gates was advocating for them, right, to get their H-1Bs, and we have immigrants at the lower end of the economy. And I just want to bring that up because it's so varied, right? And there's when I talk to teachers in Naperville, they're talking about English learners, that's a wealthy suburb, but it looks a lot different than, say, new immigrants in Pilsen in downtown Chicago. So I just want to bring up that complexity when we think about this. Children of foreign-born parents account for 33% of all Illinois children in low-income families. So that's important to consider too, and obviously we're seeing that in our classrooms, aren't we? Briefly, just so important to say, I think most of us are still seeing English learners as a city-centric issue. And while obviously immigration for a long time was the city, we really started seeing a shift where immigrants were either coming to the city and moving to the suburbs or going straight to the suburbs. And so we are seeing that the grand majority are outside the city now. While we have a concentration in the city, the growth has all been outside the city. We're getting to the point that about 10% of our students identify as English learner. I have a really hard time with that statistic though, is I think it really misses the point that this is not a static population, right? That they're moving in and out of these services. And I think the more we can get that across to our teachers and to our policymakers, especially the policymakers, right? I believe every policymaker can learn, right? We got to be out to teach them. But that this is a really moving population. And so this is a nice stat. It's just for Chicago Public Schools, though. It's from the consortium that 34% of students are or were English learner, and that really touches on it more, right? We're getting at about a third. Louisiana and I were talking about this on the way here. When we look at early childhood, where a grand majority of these kids are focused, between this pre-K, third grade range, it's about half.
It's almost half.
Are or
and it
were.
makes sense if you think about language development and what happens during those early years. The concentration is bigger in the lower pre-K through third grade.
Yeah. So I think that those are the kind of statistics that generate more power, right, and give us a deeper consideration for just how wide-reaching this issue can be. 66% of English learners are outside the city. So really briefly, when we look at growth, just a short period, 2004 to 2012, we had overall in the state grew by 24%. We actually had a decline in the city. Isn't that interesting? All the growth was outside. I find that completely fascinating. This doesn't come out really well. It's not as pretty. I think this should be really pretty, though, and we should wear shirts with this because it's so interesting. This is a map, 2005 to 2012. The darker the color, the greater concentration. We have obviously still more concentration in the city, but the green dots, sorry, can you guys see? The green dots that are throughout the map on the right side are in a 7-year period. We had more than 100% growth. All outside. Look at it. It's all throughout that state. 100% growth in those areas of English learners. So this is our state. This is how it's changing. And education really needs to be at the forefront in thinking about what this means in our classrooms. Yeah.
Just because you know awesome stats. Do you have any stats on, for years now at the university level, we've had at all our state universities a good influx of international students. Dubai, Governor State University, ISU. And when I talk to the international students, most of them aren't planning on going back. They plan on staying. And do they just not? And they're very bright.
Yeah.
So if they're having children, I would assume, you know, there's an international statistics, like you said, there's some of them doing well. Are they not staying in Illinois?
The ones that are doing well?
Right. Like all these students we have in our colleges that are extremely bright, that are international, big international programs. And then would think their children, although bilingual, I would imagine, would be at the higher end of academia. So are we seeing some of our second language students
like a divide in how they're performing?
Right, where you said, you know, we have a bunch at the bottom performing, yes, we have some that did well, but is that going well, getting higher? Because
I think that what we see, and I perfectly understand where you're coming from, is that many of those highly educated parents sometimes, raising a bilingual child is really hard because there's very few support. So a lot of these children are not growing up bilingual, or they are growing up bilingual, but they're not in bilingual classrooms, are not statistically considered bilingual because they do not receive services, and that's how they get reflected in these statistics. Purely anecdotal data, I've had a couple of students in my classes do some action research around parental support of home language, and what they found is that parents, number one, are not always very conscious of the value that bilingualism has in terms of how valuable, and that they find it very hard because there are very little supports in schools, or those, that do remain bilingual have maybe go to their home language classes outside, so they go under the radar. The ones that, these statistics are of children who have been tested and have qualified to receive bilingual services. And they tend to be, like Rebecca is pointing out, maybe on the lower socioeconomic end of the continuum. So I don't, that was a very long and convoluted.
No, and it's a really good question, because I think that what can be confusing, and I don't use that stat here, about when we look at analyses of home language surveys, and you answer this question of, is there another language spoken at home? And I think that can be kind of a misleading. It's like 1 out of every 4 now in the state. Certain areas of the city, it's 1 out of every 3, and that's like, oh my gosh, that's so high. But it's a really nuanced, broad context of families where it could be poor socioeconomic background, where the entire family, entire community is kind of isolated, speaking another language. It could be that the parents are speaking more than one language at home, evoking that survey, but the kids are growing up a little more English dominant, depending on the context that they're exposed to. It could be that everyone's freely bilingual in the family. It's just such a nuanced and broad perspective. But yeah, the ones that are coming in and that after they take that survey and then are screened as needing support in English, we're seeing that there's definitely higher instances of poverty. And this is where you get all these complexities too about parent education level and right, and abilities to write and read. It's just more complex. Yeah, no, but I'm glad we're asking questions. This is where we've had a new presence of English learners. I wish this was like easier to see. It's like a little, but again, you can see where different parts of our state. This is very new, right? This was just the breakdown to really highlight what Luisiana was saying and what we're all passionate about in this room, is our candidates that are seeking the early childhood endorsement. This is where the great concentration of these kids are. So as a really big picture, we had a heightened immigration, late 90s, early 2000s, those folks had babies. That's who's coming in the system. So it's not as much of an issue about legal status, right? But still has everything to do about how language and culture will be treated and how that'll shape their integration in the US. And then I wanted to break down that pre-K to 3rd grade more to see what it meant. So I think this is so interesting. Do we all know why the pre-K is short and then it jumps at kindergarten? Latinos have the lowest preschool enrollment rates. So that's a huge, huge issue, we know. And we know that cultivating language early on is so important, and we know language continuity is so, I mean, I'm preaching to the choir, but how important that is to keep that home language going at this critical stage while exposing them to English, right? And how important it is, but we have a lot of work to do. And a lot of this too, there's kind of a misnomer that cultural issues are what's preventing folks from enrolling in preschool, and we're finding it more and more to be an issue of access. Just the availability of those services. Remember, Mexico has preschool now mandated. So it's,
and the attendance is likely 95%.
Is that right?
Yes.
Oh, wow, that's awesome.
Yes.
So, and then one thing I want to point out really quickly too is how quickly kids are moving out of these services. Really important, because research is showing to get kind of initiating social English that can happen between 1 and 3 years, and the kids can pick up the social English pretty quick, but that deeper academic language, 5 to 7 years, some folks say 9. So there's a lot of reasons why we have that, but I do want to point out how quickly they're moving out of these services. I still think there's some misunderstanding about it. I think there's also policy measures. Mandated testing in English doesn't help us, right? We got to get them to English by that 3rd grade, right? Not understanding that we're not going to have those long-term gains when we push that English only. But I like to look at reasons for exit. Totally changes from year to year. There's no kind of rhyme or reason. But 2012, we had 64% exit because they scored proficient on Access, the English language development exam. We had 35% exit for other reasons. Big one is parent refusal. I had 1 year where the parent refusal rate was a little higher than the Access. Isn't that interesting? Just changing. So just to point out, and this is part of something that I've worked with Luisiana and Maria, is we've got kids moving out of services for a variety of reasons pretty quickly. That means not just the bilingual ESL specialist needs knowledge about English learners, but our gen ed teachers, right? Because for a lot of reasons, they're getting kids with different English language development levels, different content knowledge levels in their classroom. And so that's a policy initiative we're thinking a lot about. How do we get gen ed understanding this issue as well? Because they're in their classroom. And especially you think downstate, right? In those schools, we're going to see a lot of gen ed teachers, yeah.
Isn't another reason for pre-K, this is a population that totally values family. And they're not eager to send their 3-year-old off to school because they value family. I don't mean that in a negative way. I
No,
mean
no,
in a
no.
positive way. There's some people pounding on the door, can't wait to put their child on a bus. But there's other people that are just like, I mean, some of them, they want to do a great job with raising their child before sending them off to school. So even making it available, I would think some in that staff is the fact that they're very proud of their family time.
But that's absolutely true, but I think, and it sort of aligns to what you're bringing up, they're also concerned about the cultural and linguistic responsiveness of the programs where they're going to send their children. They worry, will I be able to communicate with the program and talk to the teachers, or will they be, pushing some agenda that maybe goes against what I value as a parent or as a community member. So it's a very nuanced picture.
It's just that awesome thing that they value family.
Yes, yeah.
Can you come and speak at our school and talk about how great it is that you want your children to surround you?
Yeah, but like I said, there was a study in Mexico City of pre-K attendance among 4 and 5-year-olds, and it was like 95%. So again, maybe because those programs were seen as more aligned with their culture. So it's complicated, as everything around the young children and families is.
I mean, some analyses too is that facilities have developed or were put, I mean, remember when Head Start was growing in the 60s and 70s, where the population was, especially I'm thinking in the city, I'm being very city-centric right now. A lot of that population has declined and moved out, and where the growth has been is in a lot of Latino-dominant neighborhoods where there was less facilities too. So it's kind of a mix of all these factors, yeah, going into issues of access. Do we know this percentage of Illinois teachers who identify as white? So who thinks it's 60? 70? Do you guys think it's 70? Who thinks it's 80? Yeah, and who thinks it's 90? Ooh, we got like a mix on that one. It's 83%. And I think this isn't the fairest of fair, right? You can be white and be incredibly linguistically and culturally competent and be of color and not be, right? You can be white and Polish. I mean, there's a lot of nuances to this, but I think we can infer from this that our student population is just so different from our teachers, and the critical role that higher ed has in preparing our teachers for this language and cultural difference is only getting greater and greater, right? And there's a lot of nuance to that. So I wanted to get at Common Core just a little. Luciana's going to go deeper on it. But I think there's a mix of opportunities and challenges. I love, love, love the idea, because the bilingual ESL specialists have always talked in a way about language that's so important. And I love that Common Core is bringing some of that discourse to the mainstream and putting it in standards, right? That all teachers are language teachers. Yep, you don't just teach math, you don't just teach science, that you teach the language and the literacy of that content area. I love that. But there are some challenges. We can get into it a little bit today. There was little mention of English learners and second language acquisition, and there's a really high expectation of English language proficiency when they start those PARCC exams. And there's questions about the appropriateness of that, right? And also, if you look at a lot, and I do a lot of talks in immigrant communities about Common Core, there's videos about how we're behind internationally, right? And these standards are so that we're competitive and speaking the same rhetoric around competitiveness. And you can go to whatever country, and they're learning more than one language to be competitive internationally, right? That bilingualism and biliteracy is so prioritized, and what a missed opportunity that wasn't part of our definition of college and career readiness, not just because it would make us more economically competitive, and it does, but it would support the instructional approaches that we know are best for these kids, right? Instead of looking at that language, that the home language as a deficit to hold them back. Yeah.
Right. I just wonder, with the Latino Policy Forum or other,
Yeah.
Where can we go to work to support true bilingualism as a goal? I mean, where can we go to do that? I mean, I'm not saying that
It's a fair question.
I mean, where can we do that? Because it's ridiculous the amount of time we spend effort we spend in helping these students learn English, which is not a bad thing.
No.
And not help them do this other thing, which, as you say, we know is good. And then, middle school and high school, we try to, I
Introduce
get them
it.
back
Yeah,
to do it. It's like, okay, look, if we, for all those many students who at 3 and 4 were fluent in a language other than English, and maybe we're bilingual because they've been going, to childcare and English, we then let them lose their proficiency, and then they're 12 years old, and we say, oh, now
By the way,
it's
it's
time to take a foreign language.
Yeah. And I think you're completely right. And one thing that we're not going to fix overnight is the imposition of an assessment system with a monolingual English bias, right? And how that's kind of setting us up in ways. I think I have a lot of concerns about not just standardized testing in English and how that's meaning we're shoving down English, decoding and basic skills over kind of deeper levels of building comprehension and a rich discourse, all those things. Also an eval system that I don't think is sensitive to these kind of issues. And overnight, I don't think we're going to fix that. A little piece that could help, I have heard some discussions about developing Spanish language assessments, standards and assessments for K-2. Could be a pretty beautiful thing. I don't know if they would be high stakes, but they could be a little piece.
So that then brings to the other issue I wrote down, which is, yes, the majority of children who speak a language other than English speak Spanish.
But not all of them.
But not all of them.
Yeah,
And
it's
what
like
do we do?
80%.
Right,
Yeah.
and especially in Chicago, where you
Yeah.
can be in these classrooms where there's
They're the
different
same 10,
languages.
12.
But also Peoria, other places are seeing the linguistic diversity. Yeah, and it's not a quick
In the
fix.
same classroom, you have, multiple languages.
Yeah.
Even if multilingual teachers probably trilingual or something and not, decilingual.
I think
It's complex.
valuing bilingualism is a cultural shift. And I think that all of you here who are training educators and working in higher, it can contribute to that conversation. Now, it's going to take a lot of work, a lot of advocating and campaigning and voting and to change our cultural perception that being bilingual is a deficit rather than an asset. I don't know if you know that, Illinois became one of the states that passed the seal of biliteracy, which means that when you graduate high school, you are bilingual and biliterate in any language, you'll get something on your high school diploma that says you are bilingual, and that will hopefully contribute to raise the status of being bilingual. But we're far from there because we don't know how we're going to assess bilingualism and biliteracy, so that's all in flux, but yes.
And I don't want to take this off topic, and I'm sure everybody in here knows, but I always have to say this. When we look at international education, if we take out poor kids, we are doing really well. And so I just think this issue of class socioeconomic status, it's the background for everything that we keep talking about.
It's totally true.
And to go back, you guys weren't here last night, were you?
No.
They had the,
And this won't fix poverty.
and
right?
it won't, no.
Yeah,
No.
yeah,
But
totally
I
agree.
think if we don't always say, we have to think about issues of poverty within all this. So the executive, whatever, the head of the IBHE was here last night, talking about how everybody has to go to college so that they won't be poor, right? And it seems to me, and what he was leaving out was, you're poor, so you're not going to college, so go to college so you won't be poor anymore. But it's still that assimilation model. It's not.
And I don't know if that's going to work anymore either.
I think it's gonna work, but
There's still
it's like.
way too many jobs, which counts as one.
But again, I think if we don't frame these things in these larger social issues, which you've done, but
No, but
I think it's just.
And we can make teachers incredibly linguistically and culturally competent, and it still doesn't matter if your kid didn't eat the night before, or right, there was domestic violence or trauma at home. It doesn't fix that, right? So I think it's completely fair. I think it's completely fair. Yeah, I worry about education reform because it tends to be without context. We're doing things like extrapolating one variable in the mix, the teacher, right? And they're going to fix everything. And I really get nervous about those kind of conversations. Not only are they one-dimensional, but it really takes the conversation off from the harder, deeper conversations about growing inequality. And I think we do a really good job of that in education reform. It tends to be very myopic, closed discussions.
Yes, absolutely.
That's my opinion. Yeah, I agree. So I am going to go back to language now that, and not talk about poverty. But I totally appreciate, what's being said, though, right? I mean, it's an important conversation. And in dealing with immigrant families, it's definitely comes up, right? If you're working 2-3 jobs and we're like, talk to your kid and read, and they're like, well, so, but I do want to give some examples that come from a book. It's a really good book, and I just want to give these examples because I think if you're with teachers or teacher candidates trying to talk about language, sometimes it can get to be part of, a diversity course, and it can be sort of superficial, and oh yeah, I care about language, I respect it, but we really don't get at the heart of how much language matters in learning. And so these examples are from math, and I just think they're really great about how this might be confusing for a kid with limited academic language, but also especially if you come from a home where a language isn't spoken. But how do we find out mean? That's another one of those multi-meaning words, isn't it? Am I talking about an attitude when I'm talking about the mean for numbers? No. Whether someone is nice or mean. What am I talking about? I'm looking for the mean value. It just gives this example of how in-depth language can be, right? I like this one, challenges of word problems. Suppose you and 3 friends buy a large pizza. You each pay with a $5 bill. The pizza costs $12.75. You will also pay 83-cent tax on the pizza. How much change will you and your friends get? So we can see how confusing that could be for kids and how problematic it would be if we just give kids a worksheet by themselves in a solitary way to figure this out by themselves. And how much more we could get from kids if they were in a cooperative learning environment, different levels of English language proficiency, different levels of content area knowledge, working together, maybe acting it out. We could see how that could be so much more beneficial. But again, I think oral language can get downplayed in the classroom a lot. And we tend to get back to solitary work on reading and writing because of the type of high-stakes environment we're in. But this could be confusing for kids. But if you acted it out, and they can negotiate meaning, how much more beneficial that could be. This I love. Prepositions, 6 divided by 12, 6 divided into 12. You're changing one word. And you get an entirely different meaning, right? One thing I'm doing with parents, I'm doing it with school board members, and a lot of discussions. We're looking at 3rd grade ISAT math, and then I give them the 3rd grade PARC math. Pass it out to people. If you want to do this with candidates or with folks you're trying to grow their awareness on the role of language and learning, and I say, what do you see? What's different here? It doesn't matter if you speak English or not. What do you see? There's no word. There's no numbers on the PARC exam. There's no symbols, right? You have to be able to read. So teachers are being asked to do new things, right? It's not just teach math. I got so excited. ISAT, you just see the calculation, and then they fill in A, B, C, or D. But with PARC, they have got to be able to read in math. So teachers are being asked to develop the language of math, to be able to read in math, along with teaching math. And I think that really highlights the role of language. Math teachers have to teach prepositions. I was talking with a teacher who does English language arts, and they're actually pulling him out to teach some of the other content areas about language. And he's like, yeah, the math teachers are the worst. They don't want to do the language and literacy, which maybe they're not. But it was so interesting that they saw themselves as content teachers, not language teachers. And you got to. Okay, one more, guys. On Saturday, 203 children came to the swimming pool. And let me know what you think's screwing up the kids, okay? On Sunday, 128 children came. How many more children came to the pool on Saturday than on Sunday? What's throwing off the kids? How many more? Mm-hmm. Okay, what do you got? Other folks too? So in the book, everybody, all the teachers say it's the how many more, which is confusing, right? When they did the read aloud with students, it was the than versus then. Yeah. And when I do this in talks, again, urban school board members, or I'm trying to highlight this role of language, I ask, who's from the South? Is anyone from the South? Say than.
Spell it.
Than, T-H-A-N.
Than.
Say then, T-H-E-N.
Than.
So might a teacher need phonemic awareness for how words sound orally and what that can mean for comprehension issues, right? It's just an example. You ask my husband, who's a second language learner, in a second, he's like, oh, than versus then. Like, he gets it in a second. He's like, keys, kiss, bear, beer. Like, he can immediately point out these new, don't mix up beer and bear, honey. But he immediately can pick out those sounds, right? But it highlights that what a teacher's gonna need to be aware of, right? When they're working with kids, and how that home language matters so much, right? All right, so just really briefly, usually what I do with candidates, we didn't have time today to, when I want to make this exercise so important, I say, you know, I want all kids to have access to academic language, right? That is the language of power. It's the language of tests. It's the language of the classroom. Like, I want all kids to access standard academic English, right? But my main question is, how do we treat home language in the process? And so an exercise I've done, if you guys ever want to use it, is I put up a Gwendolyn Brooks poem, who's a famous African-American author from Chicago. And it's in a, like, real cool. It talks in like a dialect of the city. And then I asked them to translate the poem into standard academic English. And that really is a nice way for them to just act out this difference between social versus academic language. And then I ask, is using a poem like that in the classroom an obstacle to learning? And it gets really divided, really contentious. And so I think we're really not getting across to people that social and academic is a continuum, and that all kids are using, even teachers, we're using social language to build that academic language. Hold your horses. You ever heard that in the classroom? That's pretty social. My husband would be like, why are we talking about caballos? But we're using that to build that academic language, right? And that how they're coming and speaking is a resource for moving into that academic language. I think we're still seeing it as a dichotomy, right? That how you speak at home, that street talk, that doesn't belong here. Here we do academic, and that's just not how it works. Yeah.
Well, and it's not just social language and academic language. There's how you talk about car repairs is different.
Yeah.
And if you work in a car repair place, it's different than if you work in
Yeah.
a doctor's office. It's different than,
Than a
you have
text.
a lot of
Yeah.
different little codes.
Different
It's not
registers.
and even your social language, how you talk with your teenage buddies as opposed to how you talk socially
Yeah.
at church. It's still social, but it's different.
Completely
Well, and
agree.
academic language is very
one more
nuanced
thing.
because
But, yeah.
the language of science is different from the language of math, or
Yep.
you know,
Or academic language in a philosophy class
exactly.
is different than academic language in
Yeah.
But I think it's an important exercise with teacher candidates. I mean, I'm shocked at how divided and contentious it gets. Because number one, I think it's important to talk about social and academic with monolinguals can be different than, if you've learned another language, it's super intuitive, this idea. I cover this with immigrant parents, and they're like, oh yeah, totally, at work, I've got a certain lingo, but man, if you pulled me in a different context, I wouldn't have it. Like, they get this because at some point, most of them have tried to learn English, right? But with monolingual candidates, I've had to find different techniques to kind of break this down. Otherwise, it's kind of just shaking your shoulder and, oh yeah, I respect language, but they're not really getting this deeper notion of how connected it is with learning. It's inextricably linked with learning. This intentional development, we know this, across the 4 domains of language learning. I can't tell you, I've done it with in-service teachers, pre-service, when I ask them what's the most important to emphasize and develop to build reading, what do you think they say? Say, we want to push reading comprehension for our kids. What do we emphasize? What do you think they say? Your teacher candidates, what would they tell you?
The alphabet.
Reading and writing. They like push reading and writing. Well, they're getting assessed with reading and writing. And really downplayed is oral language development and that critical role. Remember, our English learners are on par with non-English learners when it comes to decoding. They can sound it out as good as anybody, right? I'm going to start doing this
Sometimes better.
example of I'm going to start bringing in those energy drinks, and I'm going to start decoding the ingredients. I can decode, but I cannot tell you what I just read. I have zero comprehension of those fancy chemical words, right? And that's what's happening to our English learners, right? They're decoding, they're sounding it out, they're pronouncing, but they're not having that deeper comprehension. And for all of us, it's through that oral conversation. And if they're accessing it in that first language, you want to build that, keep that going. Most misunderstood we know is language transfer, right? The more we build that home language, it's going to transfer into English. That is the most misunderstood aspect in policy. And this is just such a beautiful example. It's out of Margot's book. But of the academic language, in just one unit, especially academic language, we get the cognates, right? I would say more than the social. And look at all these: denominator, denominador, convert, convertir. Like we see, they're so vivid, right? And this is just one unit. But again, it's not just, and I do these, I talk about these with immigrant parents. They get this. They get building language. We can't be talking down to our parents because they are such critical partners in this, and they get it. And this, when I show it, they're like, I want this, I want to take it home. But remember, it's not drilling kids on these differences, right? We have to build these in context. And also what usually kids aren't getting, and such a key role, is the link between the two. Often how we're building English and how we're building the other language are really dichotomous experiences. And we're often not showing kids the link between the two languages and the power in that. Alrighty, this is my transition slide to the...
Okay, so I'm gonna just try to, yes, old Dewey, he knew it, and he was what we call in Spanish preclaro. So I'm gonna try to just get this a little bit in context of what it means for us as teacher educators. What is it that we need to do? What are the challenges that these new demands of Common Core are bringing to the students that we're teaching? And all these demographics that we talk about, they matter because teachers are going to have students who are dual language learners, as I prefer to call them. It's my own, because I think it shows value for both languages that these kids are. But officially, it's ELLs and sometimes, if you're writing a grant for the Department of Education, is limited English proficiency that you have to use to label. So one of the things that I think is really important, and it speaks so closely to what Rebecca was pointing out, is that our teachers need to understand that children who are growing up with two languages, although they are along a very, very large continuum from, balanced bilinguals in which they are equally strong in both their languages to having one of the languages being very dominant. But what research has told us is that these young learners have certain strengths that that teachers need to capitalize on, particularly to be able to help the kids meet these enhanced standards of the Common Core today. We know that dual language learners are better and the research is now showing that from very early age in some nonverbal executive functioning, like being able to ignore distractors in a task, no relevant factors when they're doing a task. And where do you think that might be really useful? In schools, because kids are often asked to do things and they need to, like for example, in reading those math problems, being able to ignore non-relevant information is really important. Dual language learners there's emergent research showing that they tend to develop theory of mind sometimes a little earlier. That is the ability to read what other people are thinking or feeling, or that they tend to achieve certain benchmarks earlier. And again, this is, one has to look at the context of this, because not every dual language learners, but it's important that teachers see these advantages that come. Syntactic and morphological awareness, and that's why they're good at decoding and sometimes better. And metalinguistic awareness of how language works. And all these things the kids bring with them when they come with more than one language to the classroom. So it's really important to, make very explicit that these children, yes, they will be challenged by the push for English and the test, but also they bring strengths that we need to recognize. And we know that literacy development for all children has a strong connection to cognitive and language development. For children who are growing up for one language, one of the things that is important for teachers to take into consideration is that the connections that between the two languages. This brings another layer of both complexity and need, but also of strengths. And so if you're not aware how, for example, that Rebecca's husband can really make, these distinctions more easily because he's working with two different coding systems, you'll not be able to capitalize and use that in literacy development. And so the message, which you all know, again, preaching to the converted, bilingual children bring very specific strengths to the classroom. And often our teacher candidates are not attuned to these strengths or lack the strategies or the skills to be able to tap into those to help them learn. So this is just some of the things, some of the sort of the teaching needs that what teachers need to know in order to work with these children. And we're gonna I'm gonna go not stop there for long. You can take a quick look, and then because I want us to get to a little interactive think, pair, share exercise that I have for you with the Common Core and specifically the English language arts, some of the standards. So I'm going to pass out this handout, and it has an example from English language arts from each K through third grade, because, as an early childhood educator, but they get more complex as you go up and I want you to turn to your partner and take a couple of minutes to think about what do you think would be the challenges or the opportunities that for dual language learners when they engage when teachers try to help them meet the standards. I think this is. So just, take a look at the sample standards and just tell me both challenges, what would be challenges, or are there things that you know about English language learners or dual language learners or bilingual students that you think would be helpful as to help them navigate meeting those standards? Okay, let's come back and share some of the things that you talked in your table or with your partners. So the kindergarten standard says, demonstrate knowledge of letter sound correspondence by producing the primary or most frequent sound for each consonant. Now, what would be challenging or for the child, what would the teacher have to do in order to support it? Or are there some things that dual language learners maybe bring with them that may facilitate the meeting of such a standard, and something that the teacher can sort of latch on to help that child achieve the standard? Yes?
challenge would be their prior experiences to kindergarten.
Okay, so what experiences to kindergarten? Tell me a little bit more about
So
that.
if they didn't receive like a quality pre-K experience that kind of focused on letter recognition and sound, that automatically puts
Yeah.
them behind. on the
Yes,
curve.
that would be, and like Rebecca was saying, for example, for Latino children, preschool attendance is lower than. So other challenge or opportunity. I heard some of the things that you were saying in regards to I don't want to put you on the spot, but do you want to share?
You can put them on the spot.
Ah,
That in reality, the Spanish language, the vowels, wherever you see them in any word, is the same sound,
and consonants too.
and consonants too.
Yeah.
While in English, is a headache.
Yes, and we're talking about two alphabetic languages.
Yes.
Now, this can also be an opportunity because, like we said before, dual language learners sometimes have a greater awareness of how language works. So you can say, oh, look at this. And remember, all these are referring to English. They're going to be tested, or not in kindergarten, but down the line on this particular kind of proficiency in English. So that is one of the issues, I think one of the biggest. But also, if teachers intentionally use cognates or contrast, show and latch onto this sort of meta-linguistic awareness that dual language have about how language works, they can then point to the contrast or the commonalities in the sounds between, let's say, Spanish and English, which was, that is a bigger challenge if you're talking about Chinese, which is a character language, or other non-alphabetic.
Russian with a
Yes,
different alphabet.
yeah, exactly.
Alphabetic with
Yeah,
a
yes.
different
So,
alphabet.
so.
All that's metacognition that might be useful.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. But in order to do this, teachers need to know about this, about dual language development and what are the challenges, and they have to be specifically encouraged and taught to use these things during their candidacy and also when they have in front of their own classroom. Let's go to the third grade since I don't want to keep you longer. So the third grade standard says, determine the meaning of words and phrases as they are used in a text, distinguishing between literal from non-literal language. So that's a third grade Common Core standard. Now, what would be the challenge there?
The challenge is, it's a challenge for not just third grade.
Exactly. Yes, absolutely. That's the biggest challenge.
And also, I was saying, a friend of mine is a teacher of deaf education, and she said that's a huge thing in that world too, because they don't know literal from non-literal, and your exact example of hold your horses. I mean,
Yes,
that's
what does that
exactly-
mean? Yeah. There's a particular cultural understanding around hold your horses that, if that's the first time you hear it and you are proficient enough to understand what that means, we say, hold your horses, what is this woman? And you are maybe, having a conversation about science or something. What is going on?
Also generational and every year, like when all of a sudden someone says, let's bounce, I'm like, what does that mean? Yes. And that's that has meaning in a different way now, so every year there's more of this uprise. Let's go. And the kids-
So very, very true. Can someone think of an opportunity that maybe can be attached to being culturally linguistically diverse and thinking about literal and non-literal meaning? Oh, what a difficult word that is.
I was thinking about how you have to realize that because it's non-literal, it doesn't translate exactly. But every language has non-literal phrases. I don't know, I'm not really fluent in any language other than English, but so you can't, it's that whole, the translator, the using a computer weird translate thing, the
Yeah.
whole,
Yes.
you know, my spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak, and you translate it back and forth, the meat is rotten and the body is good, or whatever. Because it's, well, you know, so that just to even be thinking about that, because of course, teachers of young children, I would think most teachers of young children would realize that nonverbal language is difficult. Because
Yes.
of course, it's a cognitively difficult thing.
Even for monolingual English speakers.
It becomes difficult.
Yeah.
And even just to talk about
But
that, how you can't just translate.
And I think also the point that you made about bringing something from the child's culture that maybe illustrates something similar to hold your horses or something, and having a discussion about how this is similar but different in each of the languages. So, yes.
And I think also on that note, recognizing that it's not just us going to the child, we need to go to families and parents and build positive relationships.
Good.
Because asking a child what's a phrase you may use, that's a really complicated thing
Yes,
for a
yes,
third grader,
yeah,
any
yeah.
third grader to understand. So reaching out to parents and talking with families, having positive relationships, which means you have to be aware of what we bring to the table as teachers, what our classroom brings, what our school brings, and what that relationship looks like.
Absolutely.
Right, that could be a great thing about literal or non-literal language to have asked parents, especially if you had multiple languages in your classroom besides English. Can you send some examples of, you know,
Can the parent come in and show, some examples, share it and then tell them the literal meaning and talk. So really drawing on the wealth of knowledge that not only these children bring to the classroom, but having, a diverse, teaching to a diverse population. Of course, this is hard work and it requires, preparation and in-depth understanding, which is why I think Common Core has created such a mixed response about teacher educators, because it's not that we don't understand the importance of developing, higher thinking skills. It's just that there's not been a corresponding support. Then, well, how do you do this when we have such diversity and such a wealth of knowledge, but that looks different, that our students and families bring to school? Before we go, I want to show you another Common Core, and this time from kindergarten. And this was the only one I could find that I thought sort of made it a little bit clearer. And I want you to read it and tell me, what do you see there that is different? This is a pretty higher level, shades of meaning on verbs like walk, march, strut, prance, but it says by acting out the meanings. So again, and this was the only one I could find, and I looked at them for up to like 6th grade. Maybe there are others, I doubt it very much. But this one, it really, number one, it suggests to the teacher or whoever is reading this standard that this can be evaluated by nonverbal means, that comprehension is not just language, that there are other ways of showing meaning, which might be very, very appropriate for dual language learners, but for all learners across, the great diversity that you have. But, and also that dual language learners often need non-linguistic modalities to attach meaning to a word. If I say to a child, strut, but I think strutting is like going like this, I'm not even sure what it means. I show them, or I say walking like
I'm not even sure. Yeah. There you
like
go.
that. So if I do that, then everybody's going to get, oh, look at the teacher, or other kids act it out. So I think that this shows that it's not that the expectations are wrong or too high for our children. It's just that they have been written in a way, number one, that privilege English language proficiency, and number two, don't provide our teacher candidates and teachers enough information and support so they can make this work in the classroom. Because it definitely can work. but it's going to necessitate time, it's going to necessitate a concerted effort towards changing how we teach.
And to your point too, it's not acknowledging the role of native language in this process
No,
too, right?
it's not. No. And maybe, I don't know. I can't think of a word in Spanish that means strut, but I'm sure that or in other languages, you can resort to using, okay, this is what this strut means in your home language. So there are lots of ways in which this could work, but we just have to be more intentional about meeting the needs of all children. And in this particular conversation, we're talking about dual language learners, but I'm sure that this is a conversation that all of you have had about children with different learning needs or developmental needs. So it can be done, but it's just asking us to be very, very thoughtful and intentional about it. And I think, to your point, Lisa, I think also is asking us to be critical and say, okay, in order for this to work, there's some things that need to change. Because as they exist right now, they're not being they're not really making teacher educators or the teachers' work easier and better. The purpose of this is being defeated because it's not paying attention to the nuances of the students that we have. So I think that we are on the clock, but questions or comments that, we really wanted to hear your voices and what opportunities and challenges you are finding in your universities and colleges around working with Common Core, with dual language and other students. Yes.
Well, I think just the lack of faculty who have that knowledge. I mean, it's a huge one. Or who even want, that they think they get it, but they're not really paying attention to what they're not getting or where their resistances might be.
I struggle with what to do with students because in the Quad City area, just in Rock Island County, I don't have the exact number, but it usually is between 50 and 60 different languages spoken in that county. Yeah. And the number 2 language is Burmese. So, where do we go even for resources?
Yes.
Because it's a challenge.
It's a huge challenge.
Togolese to Burmese as the number 2, and it kind of depends on our meatpacking industry who has come in for that workforce. But it's not the Spanish language or the variations of the Spanish language, or even the French from Africa is not your traditional French. I mean, it's resources that I would love to have access to, because for the faculty, and then again for our students and our centers that are working with these children, and really at a crucial time where you could do something.
Well, exactly. And it might be that these communities are still emerging, but one of the things that it would be go back to the communities and see whether they have any resources or families that can help with that. A colleague of mine was interviewing a prospective student from Philippines that wants to come and do a master's in child development with us. And she was talking about, in Philippines, the official language is Tagalog, but they have like 200 different dialects. And you know what they're doing? They're using the elders in their communities to write and make these books for the young children that use the cultural knowledge, like concept books, around this very intricate beadwork that a particular tribe makes. So, I think that it takes effort but sometimes going to the community to find sources that we can use creatively it's one way to go.
This isn't a quick fix, but the book that I had, that I put up there by Gottlieb is the last name, on academic language. They do have like a series of books. The problem is most of them are third grade up, but there could be some younger. But she's really good about specific examples of what a teacher might do in various ways. So I think that's what people are hungry for. But it was like, a science teacher was doing something on marine biology, and so it was this example of how every student was to go home and talk with the family about seafood they ate back in the home country, and then each student came in and reported on it, and then they linked it. I mean, this is just one example. I'm not saying I'm fixing this. You brought up a lot of complexity, but I find her books to be very practical and not just respect everyone, right? They really give these tangible, how you might
Strategies.
use it. Yeah.
I think that we're in a position in higher ed to start partnering with community groups.
Yes.
To start training
Yes.
the workforce. I mean, I'm the one, we brought it up yesterday, I live in Chicago and work in Chicago, and I truly believe with the city colleges, we are training the workforce that is raising the children of the city.
Yeah.
And so we have partnered with a group, a neighborhood association, where we are helping the women who work at a center. It's a cohort of women, and we are partnering with them, and they are getting access to our adult ESL, or our language learning, and then also taking our child development courses, and we are cohorting them through the program where we can all work together, we can talk about the child development issues, we can help with English, we can all start bridging these gaps, but we also have to think about how do we empower everyone, and how do we empower the parents and the child care providers in those communities. Yeah.
I have a question.
Yes.
I don't know if this is an appropriate question or not, but going back to my classroom and the students that I teach, and going back to phonetics and the first standard, if I have students in my class that themselves have difficulty with phonetics, what do I do, or how can I support them and or help them so that they can help children meet this standard?
Yeah, well, I think, it's totally appropriate question, and it's a very relevant one. I think that maybe the college can provide some supports for the students, or you can tap into community resources. For example, in District U46, which is west of Chicago, and they have a very large dual language population, mostly Spanish speaking, they have partnered with the Mexican consulate to offer parents grammar and basic, so they can help the children with because they are a whole dual language across they can help with the Spanish homework. So, again, it's complicated, and it makes my head spin as a faculty member to think of all that we have to do. It's like, the faculties are the parallel of the old kindergarten teacher that had to be everything from social worker to music, but again, trying to find those resources in the community. And
I think you're critical, though, on tapping on the power that parents bring to the table, because when I given these Common Core talks, again, I was supposed to give a talk to 250 parents. It's been well over 1,000 to the bilingual, and the parents themselves are like, please come and talk to us, because I'm talking about second language acquisition. I'm talking about how it works. I talk about language transfer. I give up the chart on the cognates. They totally get this, and they're hungry for this kind of conversation. And I think working together is where there's a tremendous amount of power on this. Yeah, I don't think there's a lot of good, well, I shouldn't say that broadly,
and
but
we don't want to keep
we need
you
more
because we're
of
5
that.
minutes over, and we'll
Oh,
stay
sorry.
around for,
Sorry.
no,
It's a good talk.
kept them.
Yeah.
So this is just our,
I think you were on there?
yeah.
Go one more, are you on there?
Yeah,
There.
I'm here. So this is just our information, oops. Oh, it's 10:30. Oh, I thought it said 10:15 outside. Oh, I'm sorry. It said it's.
She's kicking you out. No.
We have 7 more minutes.
Oh, well, More questions. Yeah. So more. And I think again, going back to your question, having and I know San Agustin is really good at that, at having some supports for students who are themselves bilingual and may need some, help with phonetics or that kind of thing. Other questions?
And that point has come up, actually. If you read, literature that's meant for gen ed candidates about building language and literacy, they talk about how there was like a turn away from a really strong focus on grammar in our schools after the 1960s, right? It used to be grammar school.
Whole language.
Right? And so that turn away, this was Catherine Snow, was a literacy specialist, Lily Wong Fillmore, who focuses on language as well at Berkeley. And they're saying that we really have an issue of generations of teachers who don't have this strong focus on language. And so what that can mean is that there might be insecurities with building language along with content in the classroom. And it's really a part of this picture, too,
Yes.
about we need teacher preparation to have a more fundamental focus on language and how to grow it in the classroom, right?
And of all parts of language, the
Yes.
mechanics of language,
Yes.
the phonetics of language, all those things are important. And again, we sort of may cringe because okay, where are we going to fit all that content in our already overloaded teacher education programs? But I think it's a very important conversation to have among faculty and see, okay, how can we incorporate this? How can we stress this? Because this is important. It's part of the knowledge of language that teachers need. So other challenges or opportunities that you are facing in your
Well, Maria and I were talking about those that are texting
oh,
and writing as if they're texting.
yeah.
Oh, their writing looks like a text.
Yeah, yes, that's another, and again,
Yeah.
you know, I think it speaks to Rebecca's comment about how teacher preparation programs often have to have some additional support for students themselves so they can, you know, become well-versed in the academic language that they're going to be
I was
teaching.
thinking that's actually a great example, though, to talk about multiple codes.
Yes,
Yeah.
You
yeah.
know,
Yeah.
it's
Yes.
a way to highlight that. We do it in a different
It-
way. In
it-
fact, you know, my 20-something child and nieces and nephews, they make fun of the fact that I text as if I were writing.
I do too.
They're like, you're not supposed to do that. I can't read it fast enough. It has to be short. You know, it's like, okay, all right.
Yeah, but
There's
it's
a
right.
purpose for
It's
that,
the
that
perfect
texting thing,
example.
so that you can see it in one glance and it's
Yes.
short and you don't have too many words. And when I put in too many words and it goes on too many lines, then he doesn't read the whole thing.
And again, it's a perfect opportunity, thank you, of code switching.
Right.
You know, how do you, if you are texting to a friend and you want to tell this friend this particular message, how would you would write it with all the abbreviated, you would be a you, just a vowel. What if you had that same question or message for your supervisor? How would you word or write that? So, you know, it is a
I
great,
think it is, then it clicks for them how that is.
that they're different codes, and being the more codes that you're proficient with, then you're multilingual, you know. So, yeah, that's
But it's also a great example of, yeah.
short or sign language, you know.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Lily Wong Fillmore, whom you know, had a video, she did a lot of work with Eskimo teachers, and she had a video that I've never forgotten. I saw it on a conference that she gave for CPS preschool teachers, showing how, you know, she was working with the kids and teaching them how to write academically. And she first wrote the text in their home dialect and told them, oh, look how rich and how we use language. And then she says, now, if we were writing this to, you know, for another context, not just to talk about us, how would it look? And then she took them and showed them all the different uses of language. And it was such a powerful lesson. It was beautifully done. So, absolutely.
They also, in that book, though, have a great example, because I think this is happening with teacher candidates who really mean well and are coming from really good intentions, about when you see children through a deficit lens of having a broken English, right? Something that needs to be
Or
fixed.
code switching.
Of how the teacher, it was a back and forth between a teacher and student, and the student was using a double negative, speaking a very specific way, and how the teacher was cutting her off and correcting her. cutting her off. And it was a very good, she had good intentions, right? She was trying to fix her language so she could speak in a better way. But how the student shut down and was not communicating at all by the end. And in fact, the student was communicating about going to an art show. Me and my mama went to an art show, and the teacher's, no, my mother and I, and was cutting her off. And not only was she trying to show interest in something where that language could have been built upon in a way to build in that academic language, but there's also parent engagement happening there. Like there's all these missed opportunities. And I've given that talk to different audiences, and it resonates with people so much about how that teacher was shutting down communication. And it was field notes from 1977.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, and still happening. I've seen it in real classrooms.
It's what all teachers need to know about language. And it's really funny because it was written in 2000, and when you read the intro, they're talking about what was goals 2000, wasn't that the new thing? What was the trendy, sexy thing? It reads like Common Core. It totally is like, we've got these new standards, and we need to get all kids to these standards, so let's heighten teacher preparation. It seriously reads exactly like how we're talking. So, yeah, it's not even a book. If you Google what all teachers need to know about language, it kind of mixes a lot of different language varieties in there. But again, I read it. It was urban school board members that were, I would say, the grand majority African American and then Latino. And I did a lot of these examples about language and how it matters. And I read that, and it was kind of this overwhelming response of the way folks in the audience could relate to being. And I asked, who in the room comes from a home or another variety of English is spoken or another language, who has felt shut down by an educator in some way? It was just overwhelming. And it was one of the few times we talked about language versus race and culture. Yeah.
There's another really great milestone research article by Sarah Michaels out in 1981 that has the very same, they're doing the sharing time. And the little girl's talking about how she went with her family to buy a winter coat and how the teacher keeps shutting her down and to the point where the child just stops
Talking.
Is Elizabeth Michaels?
Sarah Michaels.
Sarah Michaels.
M-I-C.
And this is also true of code switching. And I have to own up to the fact that when I was a bilingual and pre-K teacher, I cringed when kids used both English and Spanish in a sentence. And so I am guilty of that. And today we know that that's actually signals great cognitive complexity. And I had a student who transcribed dictated a story by I think he's Portuguese, English bilingual. And it is the most beautiful example of code switching. Every word that he uses, either in English or in Spanish, is right where it should be. He follows the rules of both languages. It's amazing. He's 5. He's 5. I asked her permission and said, can I use this? Because this is so amazing. How this child was, like the nouns he used in Spanish and then some of the action he used it is amazing. And yet, when I was a kindergarten bilingual teacher, I was guilty of saying, oh, no, or not, I don't think I corrected, I hope I didn't, but I would turn it and say it all, in one language and discourage that. Yes?
I just have a question too, it just hit me when you were saying that. So one of a common practice that we like to use is taking the children's dictation. Oh my gosh, I never even thought, how do I do that if I have a child in my class who, number one, doesn't speak maybe any, or even if they combine them and I have no clue how to write the word that they're trying to tell me. Any suggestions on that?
Yeah, well, when I did a lot of, and this was in another context, I didn't have it was when I taught somewhere else, but I had parents help me take dictation. And bringing bilingual parents that feel comfortable to take. You usually have to let them know that don't change what the child says, just take it verbatim, because they have a tendency to put it like in grown-up words sometimes. But they can be because they can take the words in Spanish. So asking parents, I always had parents come a couple of days a week to help me take dictation. Yeah. And if anybody else has another suggestion that, or has tried something along those lines.
I just want to support that it keeps, you mentioned that you talked to parents and, you know, you thought it was going to be 200 and all of a sudden, you know, you're up to 1,000
Crazy.
now.
Yeah.
And I think that's great because that's where it's at. Especially, I believe, in the Latino and Hispanic and African American culture. These parents spend time with their children. They still eat at the table together like many of us don't with our kids. I mean, I think we're racing through society and a lot of us are, and I'm guilty of it too, we're on at work and my kids are running to do a sport or whatever, and then all of a sudden I see a bilingual family that is less intimidated to put their children in all those activities for the reasons maybe you say. They have dinner together. They are reading a book together. They're having bedtime together versus all these shifts that pass in the night type thing. So if you can like empower those parents to feel good about the way they are engaged with their family and how we can use their resources and help other people understand the importance of engaging with family. Because there's a lot of, on another end, you know, and even other cultures, like the Arabic culture, I think has raced to putting their children on a lot of things too, and it's not as easy to grab them and get them sitting at the same table. I've noticed in a community where I've looked at it, they're not coming to the family things and their kids are going from sport to sport or event to event. So, and that probably has to do with what you said, poverty. People who are able to sign their children up for all these things have done so, and then they're at work all day and the family time's not happening. But we have these people who are having family time. And I would like to embrace family time and say that it's a sad thing that we don't want schools to make families think that give us your children and we'll put them on all these things and we'll teach them English too. No, come with your children because they can.
And I do think a challenge, though, is the difficulty with Common Core and how advanced academically it's gotten. And parents are, in some cases, getting the message of, just like you're saying, we'll take care of this. We got this, right? The way you're teaching division, that's not right anymore, right? There's a new way to do it. And that is a challenge, right? Because I have parents, and some are first generation, some are second or third, and I get intimidated by park math. It is hard. And this message of, yeah, don't teach them the way you knew it. And it's really, it's something we need to take seriously when we think about parent engagement, because it is intimidating.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Do you ever, oh, I thought you had your hand up.
So,
Thanks, you guys, so
Thank you
much.
so much.